Hello and welcome to another exciting edition of Biology Podcast with Mr. Zabel. In today's lesson, what we're going to be looking at is ideas that shape Darwin's thinking. And so just like all scientists, scientists are influenced by other scientists, and Darwin is no exception. And so today we're going to look at the scientists that help influence Darwin's thinking in coming up with this theory of evolution. So the theory of evolution and how we develop and change over time was actually proposed before Darwin's time. The first scientist to actually recognize that living things could change over time was a scientist by the name of Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck. And so he hypothesized that first of all, organisms could change over time if they had a desire to change. So for example, when he looked at birds, he said that birds had this internal desire to change over time, so they developed wings and feathers which allowed them to fly. Not just birds, but every organism could do this if they had the desire to change. At the time, this was a reasonable explanation, but we know today that this is a false statement. We do not simply change because we have a desire to change. He also hypothesized that if we use or disuse a specific body part, we could eventually change that over time as well. So organisms strive to be perfect, and we could change over time by selectively using various body parts. Or if we don't use them, that would eventually disappear. So for example, if you were a swimmer, and let's say you kept swimming in the water and you used your hand more often, and you eventually developed webbed fingers. Well, the more you use that, the more webbing you would have. Again, at the time this was a reasonable explanation, but again, this is considered a false statement of today's standards. And the last thing that he looked at was passing acquired traits. He basically said that parents could selectively pass the acquired trait onto their offspring, allowing them to change over time. And with genetics, again, we know that this is a false statement, that we have a probability or a chance to pass a desired trait, but we don't get to actually choose the traits that we're passing. So again, this is another false statement. These were all very revolutionary ideas in terms of evolution, but again, Darwin looked at these ideas and he, again, knew that some of them had flaws in them, but again, these ideas got him thinking about evolution and how exactly organisms could change over time. During Darwin's time, another controversial issue that was being brought up was talking about the age of the Earth. Geologists were studying the structure and the age and the history of Earth and believed that the Earth was maybe a few thousand years old and that it hadn't changed much. Most of the structures that we see today were still present 1,000 years ago. However, there were some scientists like James Hutton and Charles Lyell which concluded that the Earth is extremely old and that the processes that changed the Earth in the past are still operating today. And again, we know this today that this is a true statement, and there's a lot of facts to back this up. If we look at the Grand Canyon, this is one big piece of time that we can look at. That over time, we had the river that ran through it, and it carved out our Grand Canyon. And so they proposed that these same processes that are working today worked in the past as well. So James Hutton was a geologist that specifically looked at rocks and rock formation. He noticed that certain kinds of rocks are formed from molten lava. So Hutton proposed that forces beneath the Earth's surface can push rock layers upwards, and then over long periods of time they can actually create mountain ranges. Those mountain ranges can eventually then be worn down through rain, wind, heat, cold, and again, all these processes take a very long time. So if these processes take a long time, then the Earth must be very old as well. And eventually, James Hutton's ideas eventually influence other scientists that eventually formed the theory of plate tectonics, meaning that we have all these large plates that make up our crust of our Earth, and they're constantly being moved around and shifted around, and they are going to change again over time as well. And so if we look at this theory of plate tectonics, we can see that we have this lower mantle, which is going to be full of burning magma. The magma is going to then come to the surface in the form of lava, and it's going to come to the surface creating new rock layer on this ocean bed floor. And again, this floor is going to be moving. So again, our plates are constantly moving. This is also going to have some of this oceanic litmosphere is going to be pulled down, and it's going to be recycled and reburned and then come back up as new rock formation. And again, this process takes a very long time, so therefore the Earth must be very old. We'll also talk about how we'll have two plates will come together and they will form new mountain ranges. All right. Once these mountain ranges are formed, again, we have to rely on wind, rain, water. All of that will then work to erode then these mountain ranges. And again, that takes a long period of time as well. So in order for this to happen, the Earth must be very old. So Charles Lyell, on the other hand, then proposes this idea of uniformitism, which says that the actions that we see today must be the same ones that shaped the Earth millions of years ago. So that could be snow, rain, sleet, wind. All of those same processes that help erode mountains are still present today, and they were present millions of years ago. Charles Lyell then publishes a book that inspires Darwin. Darwin reads this book on his trip to the Galapagos Islands, and he observes this with his marine fossils. And he thinks and wonders, well, if the Earth could change over long periods of time, is it possible that life could change over time as well? And that it is a slow process, just like the processes that we see changing our Earth. So one observation that Charles Darwin noticed when he was on his voyage of the HMS Beagle, at the Galapagos Islands, he was looking at seashells and marine organisms and their fossil remains. As he was walking through the hills, he noticed that some of the fossil remains of these ancient sea creatures were at the top of the hill, while some of them were at the bottom. And he couldn't quite figure out how they got to this top of the hill. And again, he started thinking about what Charles Lyell was saying and James Hutton, and talking about how the Earth is changing over time. And he thought perhaps maybe these are at the top of the hill because at one point perhaps there was water filling this whole entire hillside. And so we had water in here, and so these ancient creatures, these marine creatures, died and were fossilized in this rock bed, and then over time the water receded or evaporated, and they were stuck here at now what we see as this top of the hill. Same thing down here. He noticed that some of these marine organisms were found at the top of this hill, but at the bottom of this one. And perhaps there's new rock formation which is being pushed up, and they somehow got to the top of the hill by pushing and other forces moving and driving this rock layer towards the top. And again, sometimes there's erosion, and sometimes there's wind and water, rain that pushes some of these marine organisms back down the hill. And so there's a lot of factors that he was looking at to explain how the Earth has been changing, and this is also going to help him with his theory of evolution. Another scientist that inspired Charles Darwin in his thinking about evolution was a scientist by the name of Thomas Malthus. And he reasoned that if human populations grew unchecked, there wouldn't be enough living space and food for everyone to survive. So we must have some kind of checks and balances. And this explains sea turtles and insects and a lot of other organisms that produce a lot more offspring than what they actually need to survive for that species. And so if we take a look at sea turtles, again, as they hatch, there's a ton of offspring. But out of this entire offspring, about 35% of them die before even reaching a maturity and reaching to their full size. And so why is that? Why do we make so many offspring, but we don't get to actually have all those offspring survive? Well, and that's going to be with our checks and balances, is that these will be more of a food source for other organisms, and we have to produce a large quantity because we know that the chances of these surviving are very slim. And so again, we can't grow unchecked. There has to be some kind of checks and balance system. Charles Darwin was also inspired by many farmers. He was interested in the way that they grew their crops and bred their livestock. When talking to the farmers, they used a process called artificial selection, which basically states that nature provides the variations, but then humans select the ones that are most useful. So for example, when the farmers were breeding their cows, if they had two cows, cow A and cow B, if cow A produced more milk than cow B, well, cow A is the one that they wanted to select. And they were going to selectively breed this cow with another cow, and again, their offspring would have those desired traits that we would want. So they would produce more milk. And so again, that's part of selectively breeding the ones that we want. And this was, again, artificial selection, where nature isn't playing a role. Humans are playing the role. He also looked at mustard seeds. And if we have wild mustard can be changed into a variety of different types of vegetables. We can turn it into broccoli, we can turn it into cauliflower, we can turn it into cabbage, kale, but that's going to all stem from this one type of wild mustard. And so when Charles Darwin saw this, he was looking at it going, if we have this one common ancestor that arises and we turn into cauliflower, broccoli, cabbage and kale, is it possible that humans could also do this, and all living organisms? Could they change over time as well and have different characteristics? So after talking with the farmers about artificial selection, Charles Darwin is inspired to then create his own test. And so in his test, he's going to be working with pigeons. And these pigeons down here are what we call Darwin's famous fancy pigeons. And so what he does is he selectively breeds these pigeons. And he looks for characteristics that are very unique that he can exaggerate. So he starts with one normal pigeon, and he looks for flaws, or not flaws, but certain characteristics that are unique. Perhaps there were some feathers growing outside the feet of this pigeon. Well, he looks for those, and then he breeds those two together. And then he eventually keeps breeding them over and over and over again until he gets a pigeon that looks like this, with a whole bunch of feathers coming off its feet. We also exaggerated the color, so maybe he's looking for more of a blue color, and again he just found more pigeons that had more of this blue color to them in their feathers, and again kept breeding them until he got the desired pigeon that he wanted to. And again, he did it with this pigeon as well. The over pushing here of our breastbone. We have the tail feathers that are kind of poofed up in the back. We have barnacles that are going to be on the beak of this one. Again, it's more black colored. But again, he takes one pigeon and selectively breeds it over and over again until he gets the desired traits that he wants. And so again, this is going to be a strong part to his theory of evolution, stating if we have some common ancestry, can we evolve over time? And instead of humans evolving and picking out what characteristics are going to be passed on, can nature do that? And so again, this starts his big theory of evolution. Well, that concludes our lesson for today. I hope this was a helpful podcast, and until next time, remember, keep studying biology.